best practices for user management.
Thank you, Megan. Within Sugar, there's a number of options for managing users' passwords. Obviously, users can manage their own passwords and reset their own passwords, or you can use system-generated passwords. Sometimes system-generated passwords can be more secure than what your password may come up with. If they're trying to use the password, that's not the greatest security in the world. Although Sugar does come with requirements where you can have things like capital letters or numbers or specific characters within a password. You can also use regex codes to require specific formatting to the passwords. So in that way, you can give your users or allow them to create or force them to create secure passwords. In addition, if you have email set up, you can set up forgot passwords, so users don't always have to talk to their admin to get their password reset. With system-generated password or user passwords, you can set up password expiration. This can be very good, especially at the beginning of a project. If everyone has the same default password, you may want to set those to expire after a week to force everyone to have at least changed their password once. We have some customers who have been going for 10 years and are still using the default password. Some of our customers do use password expiration once a quarter or once a month, and their users have to then change it on those time periods. Sugar also supports single sign-on, and that can be done through LDAP or SAML, which can talk to things like Google, if you have Google Business, or it can talk to Active Directory if you're on Microsoft. It can also talk to third-party single sign-on products, like something like Okta is well documented to work with Sugar, and that can include things like restricting access based on IP address or multi-factor identification, which is something along the lines of you try to log into Sugar, it sends you a text message, you have to put in that PIN number to get into Sugar. And with single sign-on, once you're logged into your computer, oftentimes you don't then have to log into Sugar. It's just automatically logging you in, and that can be extended to other programs outside of Sugar, such as a ERP or marketing automation system or anything that supports single sign-on.
All right, so now that we've talked about passwords, let's talk a little bit about adding users to Sugar. One thing that you can do to make this process a little bit easier and take some of the uncertainty out of user management is to use a consistent username format. So when you're adding new users, always put their usernames in the same format, whether that's first initial last name or first name dot last name or something like that. That will help when you are talking to users about what their username is. You'll just know the answer without having to look it up first. So it'll just be like a seamless, known quantity at that point. Something else to think about is how many system administrator users you have, and whether or not that's an appropriate number of system administrator users for the size of your organization and the number of Sugar users that you have. Obviously, you want to have the flexibility to have multiple Sugar administrators where appropriate, and Sugar definitely supports that. But, I've also seen businesses we've worked with who have 10 people using Sugar and 6 of them are system administrators, and that's probably a sign that maybe some people have some access that they shouldn't have, and you might have some issues with, too many cooks making changes and not consulting each other. Within the user profile, there is a field called Reports To, which we recommend setting up where appropriate. This is where you can specify to Sugar who someone's manager is by linking it to their manager's user account within Sugar, assuming their manager is using Sugar. If their manager is not using Sugar, then you can leave this blank in that scenario. But this can be really helpful in terms of security setup. So Sugar will make sure that the user's manager can see everything that they see. You can use it for reporting, so find me everything that has been done by the people who report to me, that sort of thing with a report. You can even use it with workflows. Send an email to the user's manager when such and such trigger event happens. So that can be a really helpful capability to be able to use in a lot of different scenarios, but you have to have that data filled out in the user profile in order to be able to use those functions. After creating a new user, if you are using teams and or roles in Sugar, you need to make sure that you remember to assign teams and roles to your new user. A lot of times I see companies who have maybe forgotten sometimes to add users to the correct role, and Sugar's default is to allow everyone to do everything essentially other than administrator functions. And so they think their system is well defined and locked down and only a few people can delete data, and then someone accidentally deletes data and you go back and find out, well, why can that user delete data? They're not supposed to be able to. No one ever assigned the role to that user. So just make that part of your user setup process is after you create the user, go into the Access tab and set the appropriate teams and or roles for that user so that they have the right security access. And then if you're using teams, you also want to make sure you remember to define that user's default team after you assign them to the correct team membership so that when they're creating new data, the new team automatically gets applied, or the correct team, I should say, automatically gets applied. Have a plan in place for how you're going to train new users and who's going to be responsible for that, whether that's having recordings from some of your initial Sugar training or having documents that you've put together with how-tos for your organization on how to use Sugar. Think about who's going to be responsible for teaching new people to use Sugar and what you want that process to look like. And then finally, think about whether there's any data in Sugar that you want to update to assign to your new user. It's a little bit difficult sometimes to come into a new organization and not know where to get started. If I have data that's already assigned to me inside of the CRM system, that helps me know, where my starting point should be.
Okay, we had a question come in. If you want to change the default team by module, how would this be accomplished?
So Sugar only has a single default team per user. A single setting, I should say. It can actually be multiple default teams, but the default team setting is a global setting for the user across all modules. If you wanted the default to change per module, you would need to look at some sort of process automation, maybe that takes care of that after the records are created. So something like a workflow, for example, could check a list of users, find the correct team for that module, and then reassign the record to the right team within that module.
And we have one customer that's using workflows to set default teams for different modules. Okay, best practices for removing users. Best practices, don't do it. You should not delete users. There's no reason to. You're not cleaning up the system. When you remove a user, you might break links to that user. Specifically, you have a bunch of accounts, contacts, opportunities, notes, emails, cases that are related to that user via the modified user or the created user or the assigned user. So if you delete those historical users, you lose all of that historical data. You're better off changing the user's status to be inactive. When you do that, Sugar will automatically prompt you to see if you want to reassign any of that user's records. And there is a reassignment tool you can get to in the users module that will help you to reassign a user's records. Although you don't necessarily have to use that rule, you can also create filters in a list view, select all the records it finds, and perform a mass update. Or if there's more complex reassignments that are required, you could use an external tool such as Starfish ETL to query the data and make determinations based on the data found to whom it should move to.
And then finally, wrapping up our user management section of our agenda today, the teams and roles, just a couple of best practices to keep in mind there. First of all, you should never delete private teams. Sugar automatically creates a private team for each user. even if you're not actively using those for anything, you can cause bizarre buggy behavior and things to happen down the line if you delete those private teams. So even if you're not using them for anything, they're not causing any issues, just go ahead and leave those in there. And on a sort of related note, you don't want to remove the users from the private teams because, again, bizarre things can happen there. So, you know, Sugar is automatically managing the private team memberships. You should go ahead and just kind of leave that alone for the most part. You can add other users, I guess, to a private team without a problem, but you don't want to remove the private teams or take anyone off of them. And then one other thing that I see somewhat frequently is people who have their roles set up in a way that they're assigning multiple roles to a single user. And that's fine as long as you understand what the implications of that are going to be, and make sure that your roles are designed in such a way to support the actual outcome you want from that. When you assign a user to multiple roles, on a permission by permission basis, the most restrictive permission will apply. So if I have one role that says I can do something and another role that says I cannot, I will not be able to do that action as a user. And so that's, again, just something to keep in mind as you design your roles. You know, only set the permissions that you actually need for that role. If it's not something that needs to be set, you can leave it in that not set status, and that way it won't impact if the roles are layered with each other. And if you're adding a user to a new role, make sure you've looked at what roles they're already in and potentially remove them for a role that no longer applies rather than just adding the new role on top of it because you may not be giving them the permissions you think you are.